Hi, Mr. Carney. Andrew Lawton with True North in Canada.
Nice
How are
to see
you?
I never do spontaneous. If you want an interview with me, like everybody else, you make a request and you can have it.
And will you accept that?
Like everybody else, if I can say, okay. Look, freedom of the press. I've been a public figure in Canada, been a public figure in the UK. I know you got to answer tough questions, and you guys, you ask tough questions, and that's fair.
Will you take media questions? Any questions? Why are you taking questions from the media? Why no questions, sir? Why no questions?
Okay, you are trespassing, so you can leave the property.
Okay.
Back this way? Okay, sorry, we're actually going to go with this.
Oh. This way, sir. This way.
This is the weirdest I've ever been treated.
Mr. Carney, why did you lie about moving Brookfield's headquarters to New York? How can Canadians trust you to stand up for this country when you lied about such simple things? Why are you using police resources to help yourself get elected, Mark? Mark Carney, again, running away from basic questions. Why did he lie about where the headquarters of Brookfield were? Why will he not become accountable to Canadians?
How well do we know Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney? Pretty well, right? He's the high-profile former governor of the Bank of Canada, who then jet-setted across the pond to become the first ever Canadian-born governor of the Bank of England. He's a mainstay in global power circles, serving the leadership role in the World Economic Forum, acting as the special envoy for climate change and finance at the United Nations, sitting on the board of a number of nonprofits promoting the net zero approach and the urgent need for climate change, and he's a wealthy and successful banker. Until recently, he was the chairman of one of Canada's largest companies, Brookfield Asset Management, which describes itself as a leading global investment firm with over $1 trillion in assets under management.
Since the day Justin Trudeau announced his resignation, Mark Carney was a favorite to replace him. The favorite, depending on who you read. Rock star economist Mark Carney, a frontrunner. The Liberal leadership is Mark Carney's to lose. What's interesting is that even before he announced, the world was already talking about him.
Before he was trying to replace Justin Trudeau as the leader of the Liberal Party, Mark Carney was an economic record breaker.
He worked his way up through a middle-class upbringing to really the top of the financial world in Canada and then in London. And then in the private sector. I mean, he's had an absolutely amazing career.
While at the Bank of Canada, Time magazine named him one of the world's most influential people in 2010 for helping keep the country's banks safe through the global financial crisis.
Mr. Carney.
Mark Carney.
Mark Carney.
Please welcome to the program, Mark Carney.
Mr. Carney is with me now. Now, you're looking very, very dapper and very cool.
Look, I mean, there's a bit of a love affair going on as well. Let's be honest, right? I mean, maybe three great love affairs in history: Romeo and Juliet, Will and Kate, and the national media and Mark Carney. I mean, the national media really likes this guy. They've known him for a long time, and they're giving him a free pass so far.
Now, if you listen to the legacy media, they'll tell you that he's the man to turn to during a crisis. That he was there, behind the scenes, with his sleeves rolled up, fixing the greatest problems we've faced in the last 30 years. Be it helping restructure Canada's finances and avoiding bankruptcy with Paul Martin and the Liberal government back in the 1990s, to steering the ship and navigating Canada through rough waters during the 2008 financial crisis with Stephen Harper and the Conservatives, hopping on over to do the same thing in the United Kingdom as the Governor of the Bank of England, or advising Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on the best course of action during the COVID-19 pandemic and resulting economic calamity of runaway inflation and the cost of living crisis we face today. There's only one problem with this narrative. It isn't true. And in fact, the more we learn about Mark Carney, the more we start to realize that something is not quite right. The mask is starting to slip, and cracks are starting to form in the foundation of his squeaky clean record. It started in late February. You see, when US President Donald Trump was sworn into office and started to put pressure on Canada in January, Mark Carney's company, Brookfield Asset Management, moved its headquarters from Toronto to New York City. Then, on Tuesday, February 25th, Mark Carney was asked about this decision, and he flat out claimed that he was not involved.
So two things. I'll just correct a few factual things. One, I was chair of Brookfield Asset Management. I ceased to be chair on the 15th, I think, of January, when I announced for leadership. Also ceased to be chair of Bloomberg as well. Ceased to be United Nations Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. Ceased to be a number of other things. So I resigned all my positions because I am all in for Canada, all in for this leadership, all in during this time of crisis to build our great country, okay? That's the first thing. Second, the decision, the formal decision of the board, happened after I ceased to be on the board. I do not have a connection with Brookfield Asset Management. No longer have a role, obviously, as I resigned in the middle of January.
However, a letter signed by Mr. Carney on December 1st, 2024, tells a different story. The letter reveals that Mark Carney, on behalf of the board at Brookfield, urged shareholders to support moving the headquarters to New York City and said that the board, which he was chairing, unanimously approved the arrangement. Conservative MP Michael Barrett provided this letter, signed by Mark Carney, as evidence.
Last night, Mark Carney lied to Canadians. He lied to Canadians, saying that his company, Brookfield Asset Management, only moved their headquarters from Canada to Donald Trump's hometown of New York City after he had resigned from the board. Now, we all know that Brookfield made that announcement on October the 31st, proving that Mr. Carney was lying to Canadians. But this morning, we can share with you a letter signed by Mark Carney on December the 1st. Now, this is days after, just days after, Donald Trump had threatened Canada for the first time with unjustified tariffs. Now, this letter says that the decision by the board, of which Mark Carney at that time was chair, was unanimous to move the headquarters and Canadian jobs to Donald Trump's hometown of New York City. And the letter implores shareholders, urges them to support the move.
Here's how it reads. We believe, however, that there is more we can do to broaden our shareholder base and gain access to the deepest pools of capital. The most common feedback that we hear from investors encourages us to position Brookfield Asset Management for inclusion in some of the most widely followed global large cap stock indices, including in the US. The board, based on, among other things, the recommendation of the GNCC, unanimously determined that the arrangement is in the best interests of Brookfield Asset Management and unanimously approved the arrangement. Accordingly, the board unanimously recommends that shareholders vote for the arrangement resolution at the meeting. So one more time, let's go through the timeline. On October 31st, 2024, Brookfield first announced that it would be leaving Canada. November 5th, 2024, President Donald Trump is re-elected. November 25th, President-elect Donald Trump threatens the 25% tariffs on Canada. December 1st, Mark Carney writes this letter to shareholders explaining the New York City move. December 20th was the shareholder vote, but get this, it was not finalized until January 27th, due in part because of the Canada Post strike that was happening. On January 16th, Mark Carney resigned from Brookfield Asset Management so that he could announce his leadership for the Liberal Party of Canada. And then on February 25th, Carney stated that he was not involved in the decision to move out of Canada. So as you can see, he got caught doing a political sleight of hand, and so at a campaign event in Oakville, Ontario, Mark Carney said that he needed to be more precise when commenting about his involvement in Brookfield Asset Management and their decision to move to New York.
There's several elements to the transaction, and I should have been more precise in my answer. There's an overall move with plan of arrangement and the plan of arrangement and the second agreement and all that, which is also pretty, it's complicated for corporation and the company which happened after that was. I think the core, though, is what are we actually talking about? We're talking about the technical change to where the head office.
Not a great start for our new and unelected Prime Minister. So here at Juno News, we decided to find out what else he's been misleading Canadians about. While he says he's a respectable banker and a steady hand for the economy, his own words and actions contradict these very claims. Let's go back through the timeline and see what else he's been fibbing about. Here's Mark Carney during the English language leadership debate for the Liberal Party on Tuesday, February 25th, saying that it was his privilege to work with Paul Martin when he balanced the books and kept the books balanced.
Well, it was my privilege to work with Paul Martin when he balanced the books and kept the books balanced. And one of the lessons of that is the need for government to continue to focus on how effectively it is spending precious taxpayers' dollars.
Former Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin balanced the budget as finance minister under the government of the Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Martin famously charted out a new course for Canada to finally get its books in order after reckless and runaway spending and ballooning deficits created by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau in the late 1960s and onwards. The problems compounded and were dumped at the feet of this Liberal government in the 1990s. They had to drastically cut the size of government and began a program review to look at each and every government program to determine if it was worth keeping. Believe it or not, the Liberals in Canada were doing Doge 30 years before Elon Musk started this initiative in the US. The Liberals didn't do this because they wanted to, they did it because they had no choice. Canada was going bankrupt. No one wanted to buy our bonds, and we came very close to defaulting on our debt. The budget that changed everything, as the right-leaning Fraser Institute described it, was introduced in 1995. See this headline: Chrétien government's historic 1995 budget restored sound fiscal policies in Ottawa. It was the 1995 budget that paved the path to finally producing a balanced budget in 1998. So what role did Mark Carney play?
Well, it was my privilege to work with Paul Martin when he balanced the books and kept the books balanced.
Well, none. Juno News found no evidence that Carney was involved in those tough decisions. He wasn't at the table. In fact, he wasn't even in the country. Mark Carney was a student studying in England in 1995. In 1998, when the budget was finally balanced, Carney had moved to New York City, where he was a banker for Goldman Sachs, not exactly working with Paul Martin to balance the books as he claimed. The Toronto Sun, to its credit, sought comment from the Carney campaign to clarify. In response, this is what the campaign had to say. He was referring to his work in government while Paul Martin was Prime Minister and kept on balancing the books, read a statement emailed to the Sun. Paul Martin went on to become Prime Minister from 2004 to 2006. And Carney was hired to work as a civil servant in the Ministry of Finance in late 2004. He was a mid-level bureaucrat, pushing papers around his desk, taking credit for the political decisions made by the Prime Minister of Canada. That is pretty bold.
At no point did Mark Carney work with Paul Martin to balance the budget. Not, at least not according to his own resume. I mean, if he wants to call in and say, oh no, I had this secret thing that I've never talked about before while I was working for Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong, I did something.
And this is just the beginning. Now, let's move on to that second claim. Mark Carney's campaign website says that as governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, Mark Carney guided Canada through one of the most turbulent economic periods in modern history, protecting jobs and helping ensure that Canada came out stronger. Bold claim, but again, it just doesn't hold up. Even CBC News had to point this out. Here's their headline: former Prime Minister Stephen Harper accuses Carney of overblowing role during financial crisis.
But today, former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper called into question some of those credentials, blasting Carney, who he tapped to run the Bank of Canada back in 2008, for overstating his role in steering Canada through the global financial crisis. In a letter, Harper accused Carney of taking credit for things he had little or nothing to do with back then, asserting that the hard calls were made by former finance minister, the late Jim Flaherty. Responding to these remarks, Carney's campaign accused Harper of engaging in revisionist history to save Pierre Poilievre.
Mr. Harper issued a letter to Canadians, and here is how that sounds. Mark Carney wants us to believe that his experience is the solution. But what is that experience? Carney's experience is not the day-to-day management of Canada's economy during the global financial crisis. I have listened with increasing disbelief to Mark Carney's attempts to take credit for things he had little or nothing to do with back then. He has been doing this at the expense of the late Jim Flaherty, among the greatest finance ministers in Canada's history, who sadly is not here to defend his record. But let me be very clear. The hard calls made during the 2008-2009 global financial crisis were made by Jim. Prime Minister Stephen Harper typically stays out of the political fray these days, so for him to issue that letter on Monday, March 3rd, he clearly felt the need to step in and correct the record. Let's move on to the next claim about Mark Carney, which is that he skillfully governed the Bank of England and that he was revered and applauded for his role that he played.
From no job to one of England's top jobs, Mark Carney, Canada's top banker, is jumping ship. Though Carney said for months it wasn't a job he wanted, today he announced he is taking over as head of the Bank of England.
After repeatedly saying he didn't want the job, Mark Carney says the decision to move across the pond next summer was the result of soul-searching.
He gets a hero's welcome in Canada for his role with Stephen Harper and Jim Flaherty during the 2008-2009 financial crash. He doesn't have the same stellar reputation with everyone in Britain, does he?
Well, Juno News' Cian Bexty caught up with former British Prime Minister Liz Truss, and here is what she had to say.
Just wanted to get your thoughts on Mark Carney and your relationship with him while you were Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and any advice you have to Canadians who think he might make a good Prime Minister.
Well, Mark Carney was Governor of the Bank of England, and under his tenure, too much money was printed, which did damage to the British economy and put our economy off track. He, at the last election, endorsed Rachel Reeves' economic policy. She's now become Chancellor. It's been a disaster for Britain. The country is heading for bankruptcy. So I would strongly recommend not backing Mark Carney or his policies on net zero, which have been disastrous for Britain and would be disastrous for Canada.
Do you trust his judgment overall, outside of ideological considerations?
Well, I believe that he made major mistakes in the management of the Bank of England. He has pushed net zero, which has been a disaster, not just for the UK, but for many countries across the world.
Thanks for your time, Prime Minister. I appreciate it.
And it isn't just Truss making this complaint. Matthew Lynn, a financial columnist for The Spectator magazine in the UK, had this to say. Just check out this headline on January 7th, 2025. Mark Carney is not fit to be Canadian PM. Let me read from this article. The trouble is, it's now clear that he was not actually very good. The bank made a whole series of mistakes under his management. Growth was consistently weak. The bank printed too much money, stoking an asset bubble, and ultimately triggering the highest inflation rate in the G7. It badly misjudged the impact of the UK's departure from the EU, allowing itself to become politicized as part of Project Fear. It lost control of regulation, as became clear during the liability-driven investment crisis during the Truss premiership. It also allowed the city to start losing its position as a leading financial center, a trend that has been accelerated since he left. It's hardly an inspiring message. It has gotten even worse since then, with Carney becoming one of the most enthusiastic supporters of Rachel Reeves during the run-up to this election, praising her expertise and vision. Whatever your politics, it is surely now clear that Reeves is hopelessly out of her depth and is turning to one of the worst chancellors in the modern era. Again and again, Carney's judgment has been terrible. True, he will make a very easy opponent for the Conservatives if he does take over as PM. But the blunt truth is this: he is not fit for the job, and Canada can do better. Not exactly stellar references. Now, in the first three examples, Carney was exaggerating his role and pretending he did things that he simply did not do. Our fourth example, interestingly, shows Mark Carney doing the exact opposite. Mark Carney has been advising former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau since 2020. And yet, before his launch, Carney went on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and claimed that he was an outsider.
A wild hypothetical. Let's say the candidate wasn't part of the government. Let's say the candidate did have a lot of economic experience. Let's say the candidate did deal with crises. Let's say the candidate had a plan to deal with the challenges in the here and now.
Sneaky, you're running as an outsider.
I am an outsider.
Even a friendly late-night talk show host saw through the ruse and called out Carney for being sneaky. You can't simultaneously claim that you were there the whole time while also casting yourself as an outsider. Now, the Canadian media would never let him get away with that, would they?
This is no time for politics as usual.
Mark Carney pitched himself as an outsider, not a politician, but someone who would have the skills needed to meet the moment.
He's running on, I've never run for anything. I'm an outsider, I'm new.
He is, though, an outsider to this government. He's never been a member of this government.
What's being set up is clearly a race that the party's going to have to decide. Do they want somebody that has been a part of the Trudeau government, or do you want an outsider?
Of course they would. The media in Canada, after all, is funded by the Liberal government. Perhaps this helps answer our next question, which is, why is Mark Carney so afraid of the independent press? It started on the afternoon he launched his campaign in Edmonton, Alberta. True North's Isaac Lamoureux, Cian Bexte, and several other independent reporters were prevented from entering Mark Carney's campaign launch event in Edmonton. Here's what that looked like.
We're here in Edmonton, and you are blockading our access. Someone who doesn't even claim to be part of the campaign, just some sort of thug standing at the door, stopping 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 journalists from walking into the building to cover someone who is going to be appointed as potentially our next prime minister. Is this the country that he's going to create? This is what you're standing behind? The lineup of people waiting to get in here. Journalists from every sort of outlet.
Carney and his goons repeated this tactic again in Oakville, Ontario. True North's Noah Jarvis was barred from entering Mark Carney's campaign event. And Carney did it again in Calgary. The Western Standard, The Rebel, and Juno News' Cian Bexte were all denied entry into this event, while Cian Bexte found a way to confront Mark Carney, and here's what that looked like.
Mr. Carney, why did you lie about moving Brookfield's headquarters to New York? How can Canadians trust you to stand up for this country when you lied about such simple things? Why are you using police resources to help yourself get elected, Mark?
This assault on the free press in Canada was so outrageous that it was condemned by the Independent Press Gallery of Canada.
The Independent Press Gallery of Canada, the IPG, strongly condemns Liberal leadership candidate Mark Carney's repeated exclusion of independent journalists from his campaign events. On January 16, 2025, during Carney's campaign launch in Edmonton, several independent journalists from True North, the Western Standard, and the Counter Signal were denied entry despite holding valid invitations. Notably, James Snell, an accredited member of the Alberta Legislative Press Gallery, was among those barred. The police were called to remove these journalists at the campaign's request. This troubling trend continued on March 4th, 2025 in Calgary, where independent journalists, including those from the Western Standard and Rebel News, were again denied entry. Carney is avoiding journalistic scrutiny, contradicting the principles enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Carney's refusal to engage with independent journalists contrasts sharply with the Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's inclusive media approach, which allows both mainstream and independent outlets to attend and question him at public events. The Independent Press Gallery calls on Mark Carney's campaign to cease these undemocratic practices immediately and to permit independent journalists to attend, report, and ask questions freely, as is their right in a true democracy. We also urge all political campaigns, regardless of their party affiliation, to respect press freedom and ensure open access to their events. Journalists, whether government-funded or independent, play a crucial role in asking tough questions and holding public figures accountable. Mark Carney's campaign must address its disturbing efforts to silence critical media voices.
So we've established that Mr. Carney doesn't like the free press, and he has a hard time sticking to the facts. Now, the only question that remains is, what is he trying to hide? Is it to do with his financial stake and where his money is invested?
He still hasn't told us what he's going to do, and we've been trying to get this information on what you're going to do about putting your conflict of interest disclosures to the public. They have ducked that over and over again, and there's a reason for this. Is that it takes 60 days to declare, once you become prime minister, 60 days to declare your conflict, and 120 days to declare it to the public. If he abides by that, then the election will be over before we'll even know what his financial interests are.
Or is it his involvement with the many organizations that he claimed to have resigned from?
I am no longer a senior executive at Brookfield. I am no longer a senior executive at Bloomberg. I am no longer on the board of Stripe. I am no longer on the board of PIMCO. I am no longer on the board of any of my commercial activities. I am no longer the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. So all of those roles, I resigned today.
Well, that didn't turn out to be true either, as the National Post reported that it spoke to numerous organizations that Carney had been affiliated with up until his leadership race announcement, and found that he still remains involved with at least 5 of them. Likewise, as reported by True North, Mark Carney's name and face was still active on the Global Carbon Marketing Utilities page, which listed Carney as a co-chair, up until late February. Or is Mark Carney trying to hide something different, something maybe darker, perhaps his mysterious relationship with disgraced pedophiles like Ghislaine Maxwell, Prince Andrew, or perhaps even Jeffrey Epstein? Or is it simply because he just doesn't always know what he's talking about?
Biggest supplier of fertilizer, biggest supplier of aluminum, biggest supplier of semiconductors. We supply almost all their semiconductors. That whole, everybody in the White House is a tech bro except for Trump. They all need semiconductors. They all come from Canada. Maybe they won't. Maybe one day they won't show up.
Or maybe he just doesn't like to be asked uncomfortable questions, like his views on contentious social issues, like boys playing in girl sports, men invading women's spaces, or the irreversible damage that comes from cross-sex chemical and surgical treatments pushed by so-called progressives onto confused young Canadians. We know he's woke, and that he wants to promote the radical doctrine of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
While America engages in a war on woke, Canadians will continue to value inclusiveness.
Mark Carney may have been hand-selected to become prime minister by Liberal insiders and delegates, but he's still an unelected official who does not hold a seat in the House of Commons, the first time that this has ever happened in Canadian history.
Mark Carney, if he won, would become the first Liberal leader who has never won an actual election anywhere, ever.
It's hard to claim that you're a liberal and a defender of democracy when you use illiberal tactics to avoid facing a free press or the electorate. And this could be the most worrying thing about Mark Carney. He considers himself a globalist and an elitist, but excuses it by saying that that is exactly what our country needs.
My strength is I know how the world works. I know how to get things done. I'm connected. I can deliver for the country. And my weakness is, people will charge me as being elitist or a globalist, to use that term, which is that's exactly, it happens to be exactly what we need.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mark Carney, Canada's new Prime Minister and our first ever totally unelected Prime Minister in Canadian history. Please share this video so that more Canadians can learn the truth. Thank you so much. I'm Candice Malcolm for Juno News. Thank you and God bless.